presentation draws on the same research project, obviously, as the project you just heard about. But really, I'm dealing in this paper with the themes that we wrote the grant for, which is essentially to look at what are the experiences in deindustrializing cities. So there's a lot of research on LGBTQ employment in larger centers, but there's not as much research in smaller cities and deindustrializing cities. And this paper is co-authored with Natalie Oswin, who's a scholar in the Department of Geography at the University of Toronto. You've already seen the slide. I just want to note that the project was done in conjunction. It was a partnership project. So it was done in conjunction with Unifor and the United Steelworkers. And we had people at the local level and at the provincial level and national level involved. And then we also had participation by worker centers in both regions, and they were very involved in the project. So in Canada, you might say that we are underneath something that's called 2S LGBTQ+ equalities framework. Canada is one of a minority of countries in the world that's gone from criminalizing queer and trans people to legally protecting them in the late 20th and early 21st century. So this framework essentially says that we have a lot of protections, that we have had cultural advances, and most people would think things are pretty good for 2S LGBTQ people in Canada. We have employment-wise protection in the human rights codes at the provincial, in the Ontario and the federal level, and almost all of the provinces, including sexual orientation dating back to the 1980s in the case of Ontario, and then we also have protection for gender identity and gender expression more recently. However, despite this protection and this idea of Canada being an LGBTQ friendly country, the research still shows persistent discrimination. So there's some research, some quantitative research by Denier and Waite in particular that looks at employer discrimination, where they send out CVs and they find that there's less response rates for those who are queer. And then there's other qualitative studies that show types of difference. So how do we understand what's going on? So at the same time that we've seen this advance in LGBTQ rights, we've also seen deindustrialization. So as everybody here is very familiar with, there have been structural changes in the economy and labor market, increasing precarity, declining employment in manufacturing, manufacturing and industrialized resource industries. And this differently affects different regions. So as Stephen High said in 2013, everywhere in Canada has faced deindustrialization, but it's only those places where declines or industry declines in these sectors have not been replaced by something else, such as increasing financialized work or financial services or whatnot, that become characterized as deindustrialized. If we take, so places where it hasn't been replaced by something else become those termed as deindustrialized cities. From a geographic perspective, we know that economic shifts are always accompanied by transformations that are sociocultural. And the sociocultural environment affects economic shifts, and then in turn, economic shifts transform the sociocultural environment. So there's been research on deindustrialization and gender, and it's essentially shown that in some cases, we have narrower gender gaps resulting from the convergence of male and female jobs. And then also there can be greater equality in the household. And there can be challenges to hegemonic masculinity as you see declines in these kind of more masculine types of jobs. However, other people have shown, particularly more recently, that sometimes deindustrialization results in a hardening of hegemonic place-based attachments. And we've seen this with the rise of populism. So it's not necessarily clear-cut what happens with gender. So the centrality of gender to deindustrialization makes deindustrialized cities a very good location to look at what's going on for LGBTQ+ workers, because we don't know what's going on. We don't know how deindustrialization will affect LGBTQ workers, and in turn, what can the experiences of LGBTQ+ workers tell us about gender and deindustrialization? So research on deindustrialization hasn't explored the experiences of a 2S LGBTQ plus workers. And meanwhile, research about 2S LGBTQ plus employment has paid little attention to the local and regional social and economic context. So most of this research on 2S, on the experiences of queer and trans workers doesn't look at how context affects it. So our research question here is, how do queer and trans workers perceive their employment opportunities in the wake of advances of LGBTQ plus legal equality in Sudbury and Windsor, cities with legacies of mining and auto manufacturing? So basically we're looking at how these two things, how do increasing equality on the one hand alongside deindustrialization and the particularities of these places affect queer and trans workers. Okay, I'm going to kind of skip this. Just trust me that these two cities are deindustrializing. Windsor is auto capital. Sudbury is nickel mining. Yes. Both have faced technological displacement. The industries are still present in those cities, though. However, the quality of jobs has gone down and the number of jobs has gone down. So I'll spend a bit more time on methods because the other group did not. So this is a very community engaged approach. This is a picture of us at the SWEAC at the Worker Center in Sudbury. And we had a community advisory groups at every stage of the research process. They helped with designing, looking at the research questions, designing the survey. We had connections with all the LGBT groups as well in the communities, as well as with First Nation organizations. And we did an e-survey that involved getting, we recruited 672 respondents to an e-survey that's across both cities. And then we did 50 face-to-face in-depth interviews. So the specificities or the specific attributes of the labor markets in Sudbury and Windsor affected the employment opportunities for 2S LGBTQ plus workers. So both cities still retain a larger share of workers in mining and manufacturing than provincial averages. But they also have a higher number of workers in health and social services than provincial averages. So we can see the labor markets as comprising three dominant tiers in these cities. So we have blue collar work, and then we'll have a lot of people in what I'm kind of loosely terming public services, including education services, healthcare and social assistance and public administration, and then low wage services. But what's really missing is a large number of people in the kind of white collar services or in white collar financial services or professional and technical. And this is a great quote to tell you about the labor market in Sudbury. So this person said, if they're not minors, your career options in Sudbury are pretty limited. Quite frankly, it's either government, hospital, mining, retail, restaurant service sector, alcoholic, drug dealer, or drug user. Those are your career options. Those are your career options in Sudbury. There were great quotes in this project. So how did these labor market structure interact with LGBTQ experiences? How did queer trans workers interact with this employment structure? So this is our survey sample, and the distribution of our interviewees was somewhat similar as well. So we see an overrepresentation of people in education, healthcare, retail, admin, mining, and manufacturing. So these are below the averages and below the percentage of workers in these sectors in both of the other cities. So we see most people who answered our survey or in the interviews were in either public sector work, low wage retail work. No, those are the two options. Okay. So one of the expected outcomes, I would say, because this is a little bit of common sense, is that most 2S LGBTQ respondents avoided blue collar work. So this is similar to many cisgendered women as well, would also avoid blue collar work. But here we say, I'm scared to go into a more male dominated industry as to how I'd be perceived. Showering would be difficult if I work in an environment where people just shower all together. So in the mines, you have to shower when you go in and out of the mine. And so that's what they're referring to. Moving forward is something I'm a lot more conscious about, like where I can go that I feel comfortable and safe. And we heard this from many people. When you ask people what types of jobs are available to them, basically no one said mining, construction. There were some respondents in those areas already, but as far as options of where to go to, no one mentioned it. However, the employment options were not only limited by the desire to not go into blue collar work, but also by the absence of other employment options in these communities in general. So one gay man said, with the factory jobs, there are a lot of very high paying jobs, but they're not the safest environments. So it cuts off a big chunk of industry in Windsor. I was lucky that being in this public sector, I barely eked in before the hiring freeze. So there's not a lot of choices. And I have many friends that have master's degrees that are working in coffee shops. There's not employment here. And a lot of people do leave Windsor because there's just nothing here. So this is, in essence, I mean, you see neoliberalism in that a little bit as well with the hiring freeze. Okay, a second main way that people's labor market opportunities were curtailed was through employment discrimination. However, here we also see the rise of LGBTQ acceptance and protections. So 40% of our respondents reported having experienced no discrimination in the workplace, which was actually somewhat surprising because we had lifetime questions and questions from your current job. This was in your work lifetime, you've never experienced discrimination on the basis of gender or sexuality. I mean, some of these people might not have been out about their gender or sexuality, so that might explain it, but still. And then there were also examples of people describing situations where they felt protected by legislation. So here's an example of a trans woman who works in a blue collar environment who essentially says that she felt protected by legislation. She said here, I'll just read the small amount. The other thing is having the Ontario government and federal government on board with having policies in place for human rights creates a lot of safety. I'm protected federally. They were the last ones to pass the human rights legislation, so I wasn't protected until last year. And she had just very recently begun to transition and had the support of her HR. And so many of you, and many trans workers in particular, did feel like they could go to their HR. However, she did experience many microaggressions as well, but she still felt this protection. But despite this, there was still some discrimination in the labor market. So when I'm talking about in the labor market here, it's did you experience discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity as a barrier to getting work? Yeah, this is by gender identity. So here we see that transgender people perceived being discriminated against in hiring, or were unsure of it to a much greater extent than cisgendered workers. And here we have a quote of someone who was interviewed who said they did face hiring discrimination, but in general, again, these numbers aren't as high as I would have expected. They might have been higher, right? So and it's particularly amongst interviewees, not many people described being discriminated against in employment. But what we did see a lot of was the indirect effects of discrimination. So that was people's apprehension and avoidance in applying for work. And because of fears of discrimination. So this was actually much more prevalent. So I would say since the layoff, I've had doubts about what I disclosed, regretfully, that ended up causing my own layoff. Emotionally, I feel since then a lot less safe about being out at work in any kind of work situation or even in terms of applying for work. Then another person, I don't want to go in for interviews because how they're going to assume it's just more of an anxiety. And then the last thing that I'm looking at is how this advances in LGBT protections combined with the persistent homonormativity and cisnormativity in the workplace or in the labor market, or rather. So here we see that in many cases, 73% of workers said that they felt supported by their employers at work. However, at the same time, this sometimes created an environment where people were reluctant to look for new work. So many people some people were in quite terrible jobs, in fact, where they weren't getting enough hours, or in poverty wages, or one person had a disabling workplace accident and talked about worker health and safety violations, but they didn't want to look for new work because they were afraid of going back into the labor market and having to deal with applying and seeing if they could, and not having a supportive employer. So this trans woman was getting so few hours that she made very, very little money and was living in poverty, and was getting very few shifts, but said, I could probably use a second job, but I'm still waiting on the name change, and I'm hesitant to looking for other jobs until the name change goes through. Honestly, I was super lucky when it came to, oh, there, unfortunately, my signature is not gonna match my name. So this led to insecurity amongst many people. We had very high rates of poverty amongst our sample, and then we also had a lot of people talking about not being able to get by. So in conclusion, for many respondents, persistent cisnormativity and heteronormativity in the labor market, tied to the legacies of industrial employment, interacted with the advances of 2S LGBTQ equalities in unexpected ways. So discrimination often affected employment options indirectly rather than directly, and there was less overt discrimination because of protections. However, and people often stayed in support of employers in poor quality workplaces, and this prevented labor mobility to better paid work. And so we need to reframe what it means to be a supportive workplace, and industrial work continues to influence the gender norms in labor market as a whole, limiting the opportunities for 2S LGBTQ workers. So what does this mean for deindustrializing places? In our case, these gender norms had stayed relatively rigid. However, advances LGBT equalities was starting to create small pockets of acceptance. And so then people would move to these pockets of acceptance, whereas the labor market as a whole still seemed or appeared fearful for most workers. That's it. That's it.